Ever grab that sugary coffee on the way to work, even when you know there are healthier choices? Like something in your brain just pushes you towards it. We're going to do a deep dive today on the science behind those cravings. Specifically, we're talking about food addiction, especially when it comes to processed foods. Our guide for this deep dive is Dr. Joan Efland, a leading expert on food addiction. She gave this presentation at the Silicon Valley Health Institute. Really fascinating stuff, and I think it might just change how we think about our own eating habits. One of the things I found super interesting was this unexpected connection Dr. Eflin makes between big tobacco and the food industry.
Yeah, it's a fascinating part of the story, and it's a little unsettling too. So back in the 1980s, as the health risks of smoking became, impossible to ignore, the tobacco giants like Philip Morris, they started looking for new markets, and their solution was to start buying up food companies like Kraft and Nabisco.
Wow, that's wild. I mean, I knew there were some big mergers back then, but I never really put it together.
Mhm.
So what was their strategy there? Did they seriously think they could get people hooked on Oreos the same way they got them hooked on cigarettes?
It sounds crazy, but that seems to have been the plan. They brought with them what Dr. Eflin calls the industrial addiction business model. It's all about maximizing craving. And they want to make it as easy as possible to get the product. Make it available everywhere, make it cheap, eliminate anything that gets in the way of you consuming it.
So kind of like how you can buy cigarettes at pretty much any gas station or convenience store these days.
Exactly. And even more concerning, maybe, is this focus on targeting the youngest consumers, kids. If Mullen points to this huge increase in advertising for sugary cereals and snacks during Saturday morning cartoons in the late 80s, that's a prime example of this tactic in action.
Yeah, makes sense, right? Get them hooked early and you've got a customer for life.
It's a scary thought. And it's something we need to be really aware of, not just as individuals, but as a society. These tactics are still everywhere today, from the way grocery stores are laid out to tempt you, to the way fast food restaurants seem to be on every corner. It's all around us, shaping our choices in really subtle but powerful ways.
So we're basically surrounded by temptation then. But how addictive are these foods really? Like, is it really addiction or just a lack of willpower? Dr. Eflin points to this startling statistic. By 1997, Americans were consuming, on average, a pound per person per day of sugar, flour, French fries, and high-fat dairy.
And what's really significant about those particular foods is that they contain substances that activate the brain's reward pathways. And they do it in ways that are very similar to addictive drugs.
So it's not just about willpower then. There's actual brain chemistry going on here.
Exactly. Take sugar, for example. It triggers the surge of dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter, and that reinforces the craving for more and more sugar.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sugar just makes you, feel good, at least for a little while.
But it goes beyond just sugar, though. Processed flour, particularly the highly glutenized kind that's common here in the U.S., that's been shown to affect the brain in a really similar way. Specifically, it triggers the release of opioids, which not only contribute to those cravings, but also lead to that kind of sluggish feeling a lot of people experience after eating a lot of bread.
Wow, I had no idea bread could actually be addictive in a similar way to opiates. What about salty snacks? I feel like I could eat a whole bag of chips without even thinking about it.
That's no coincidence either.
Hmm.
Studies show that when we consume excessive salt, it can activate those opioid receptors in our brains. And that leads to that I can't stop eating this feeling you're talking about.
Okay, so sugar, flour, salt, all highly addictive. What about dairy? Dr. Eflin included that in her list of problematic foods, too.
Dairy is interesting. It naturally contains opiates. They're designed to put baby calves to sleep so they'll feed more. Now, obviously, those opiates are present in much smaller amounts in cow's milk, but they can still trigger a sense of comfort and satisfaction. That can make dairy products particularly habit-forming for some people.
So it's not just about, like, a love for cheese. There's an actual biological reason why it can be so hard to resist that extra slice.
Precisely. But Dr. Eflin goes beyond just identifying the addictive nature of these substances. She argues that it's this combination of cravings, stress, and social influence that creates a perfect storm. It creates what she calls the Bermuda Triangle of food addiction.
The Bermuda Triangle. Okay, now this is getting interesting. Tell me more about this Bermuda Triangle and how it relates to food.
So picture a triangle, right? Each point represents a key factor that contributes to this cycle of food addiction. First, you've got the limbic system, the part of our brain responsible for cravings and pleasure. This is the system that gets hijacked by those hyper-palatable processed foods, sending out those eat more, eat now signals.
So even when we logically know we're not hungry, our limbic system is screaming for that donut.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, chronic stress plays a huge role. When we're stressed, our bodies release cortisol. And cortisol is a hormone that not only makes us feel anxious, but it also increases those cravings for comfort foods.
Oh man, so it's a vicious cycle. Stress makes you crave these addictive foods, and then those foods just perpetuate the cycle of cravings.
Right. And that brings us to the final point of the triangle, mirror neurons.
Mirror neurons, those are the ones that make us yawn when we see someone else yawn.
Right. Exactly. They're all about social learning. We are hardwired to mimic the behaviors of those around us. And this is especially true when it comes to eating.
Oh wow, so if you're trying to eat healthy, but everyone around you is ordering pizza, your brain is getting all these mixed messages. It's not just about willpower at that point, it's about your brain literally telling you to eat what others are eating.
That's exactly how Ifeflund explains it. These three factors, cravings driven by our limbic system, the stress response with its flood of cortisol, and the social mimicry of our mirror neurons, they all work together to overpower the rational part of our brain, the frontal lobe. It makes it incredibly difficult to resist those cravings through willpower alone.
So it's like our brains are kind of working against us, especially in today's world and with food being everywhere. It's no wonder so many people struggle with their eating habits. But Dr. Eflin offers some hope too, right? There's got to be a way to break free from this Bermuda Triangle.
Absolutely, and this is where her research takes a surprisingly positive turn. She's found that just as those mirror neurons can lead us astray, they can also be harnessed for good. It's all about surrounding yourself with healthy influences.
So instead of just beating ourselves up for reaching for that cookie, we can start to understand the science behind those cravings. And maybe more importantly, start to figure out how to rewire our brains for healthier habits.
Exactly. It's not about deprivation or blaming ourselves. It's about understanding the forces at play here and, ultimately finding ways to leverage our own biology to our advantage. And Dr. Eiflin has seen incredible success with this approach in her work.
That's encouraging. How does that work? If our social circles are influencing our food choices, how do we use that to our advantage?
It's surprisingly simple, but incredibly powerful. If Eiflin's research found that just being around people who model healthy eating habits can actually rewire your brain's response to food cues.
Really? Just being around people who make healthier choices can change how our brains react to food.
That's right. Remember those mirror neurons? They're always watching, always learning. So if your social circle is choosing the salad over the chips, your mirror neurons start picking up on that, and your own cravings will begin to shift.
That's fascinating. So it's like our brains are constantly adapting to the norms of our social groups, even when it comes to something like food. Makes you wonder if we should be more mindful of the company we keep, especially when it comes to our health goals.
Absolutely. If we're constantly surrounded by images of people indulging in unhealthy foods, it's going to be that much harder to resist those cravings ourselves. But if we're surrounded by people who make healthy eating a priority, it can start to shift our perception of what's normal, what's desirable.
It's like that saying, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. But like applied to our eating habits, it makes me think about Dr. Eiflin's online community, the one you mentioned where people were replacing cravings with virtual meetings.
Yes, that's a perfect example of how this principle can actually be put into practice. If Phelan created a space where people who were struggling with food addiction could connect with others who understood their challenges and who were also committed to making healthier choices.
And it worked. Just seeing other people making healthier choices actually helped them overcome their own cravings.
It did, and it speaks to the power of social connection in overcoming addiction. We're social creatures. Our brains crave that belonging and connection. By tapping into that need for connection in a healthy way, we can start to break free from those unhealthy patterns.
That's incredible. It really highlights how important that social support is, especially when we're trying to make lasting changes to our habits. But if we're still constantly bombarded with tempting food everywhere we go, how do we create that supportive environment in our daily lives?
That's a great question. And it brings us back to this broader issue of the food environment we've created. If this industrial addiction business model is so effective at hooking us on unhealthy foods, what can we do about it?
Right. It feels like a systemic problem at that point, not just an individual one.
Yeah.
Should we be pushing for stricter regulations on food marketing, especially to kids? Or maybe taxing those sugary drinks like we do with cigarettes?
These are critical questions that a lot of people are debating right now. Some people argue that regulating the food industry infringes on personal freedom, while others say that it's necessary to protect public health, especially when it comes to vulnerable populations like children.
It's like this balancing act between individual choice and public health. It reminds me of the whole debate surrounding tobacco regulations. It took decades to implement stricter regulations on the tobacco industry, even with all this overwhelming evidence about the harms of smoking. Imagine trying to take on the sugar industry.
It's a significant challenge, no doubt about it. But that doesn't mean we should give up. Awareness is the first step. By understanding the science behind food addiction and the tactics that are being used to keep us hooked, we can at least start to make more informed choices ourselves.
So knowledge is power. The more we understand about how these foods are designed to keep us coming back for more, the better equipped we are to resist those temptations.
Exactly. And we can also look for ways to support each other in making those healthier choices, whether it's joining a community like the one Dr. Evelyn created, or just being more mindful of the food that we bring into our own homes and workplaces. Every step in the right direction counts.
It's empowering to think that we can actually make a difference, even within a system that often feels like it's designed to work against us. Maybe if we can start to shift our mindset from feeling like we're fighting this uphill battle against these addictive foods to seeing ourselves as, agents of change, that's a powerful place to start. So we've talked about the power of surrounding ourselves with like a healthy tribe, but what if we kind of flip that around? What if, by making healthier choices ourselves, we could actually become part of someone else's support system?
There's a thought-provoking idea.
Right. It's like that ripple effect. Our actions, even the small ones, can inspire the people around us.
Exactly. Imagine you're at work and your coworker sees you consistently choosing a salad instead of fast food for lunch.
Hmm.
Or a friend notices you're not reaching for that bread basket at dinner anymore. Those observations, even if they're subconscious, they plant a seed.
It's like we're subtly changing the definition of normal within our social groups, like one healthy choice at a time.
Precisely. And remember those mirror neurons. They don't distinguish between conscious and unconscious actions. They're like sponges, soaking up all that information about what the people around us are doing. And then that subtly shapes our own desires.
So instead of just getting discouraged by how much unhealthy food marketing is out there, we can choose to focus on being a force for positive change in our own little corners of the world.
It's about reclaiming our relationship with food and recognizing that it's not just about calories or willpower, it's bigger than that. It's about nourishing our bodies and our minds in a way that really supports our well-being.
And it's about recognizing that we actually have a lot more power than we think to make a difference. Not just in our own lives, but in the lives of the people around us, too.
Absolutely.
I love that.
As you go about your day, just remember the incredible adaptability of your brain. Choose those healthy influences, connect with your tribe, and maybe, just maybe, you'll inspire someone else to do the same.
Food for thought. This has been a fascinating deep dive, and I really hope it helps our listeners rethink their own relationships with food.
Me too. It's been a pleasure chatting with you about it.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.